speaker this morning is David Wales. Uh, David is the founder of SharedAim Limited, a company established to help organisations deliver excellent customer experience and enhance organisational performance. Prior to this, David had a long and distinguished career in Kent Fire and Rescue Service, where he led an award-winning national study of human behaviour in fire. That was called LifeBid, and it was certainly the first time when I was working in Wales that David's work came to prominence. So, David, please, I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Des, and it's a great privilege to be part of such a timely and important event. I'm grateful to the hosts and organisers for the invitation to join you. So, understanding what we mean by learning is perhaps a debate in itself, and it's particularly resonant with me. Whilst much of our learning tends to be incremental, there are times where instead of building on previous knowledge, you learn something that's very transformative and challenges many or all of your previous assumptions. Then the issue is, how do we use that knowledge? What I learned about the human experience of fires changed both my perspective and my career path, leading me to my current role in the customer experience sector. In combination, the study and my current role allow me to offer perhaps a different perspective to one you would normally hear, and one that I hope will provide some inspiration for how we can design services for the future. It also caused me to be honest with myself and ask why I joined the fire service. My standard answer was that I wanted to serve the community, but in truth, at 18, I joined because the job appealed to me. It was a selfish choice, and for the first 20 years of my career, I saw it through that lens. I loved my job, I was proud to serve, and our public seemed very grateful for what we did. And amongst all the day-to-day tasks and professional development, I'd never really truly taken the time to understand the experience of an emergency as a member of the public. That realization only came about 20 years into my career as a result of a research study that I instigated and led to identify why the public did not behave as we advised them to or expected them to when they encountered a fire in their home. For the very first time, I heard the stories of our customer, not from the snippets of information that we decided we needed for our incident records, the things that we felt were important to us to know, not just their experience on the day, but the full end-to-end story of their experience of a fire in their own words, and how even small fires had affected their lives for many months and years afterwards. One story in particular was very powerful. I was talking to a mother who 8 months prior to my visit had had a small fire caused by some work in the road from a utility company, which had caused the electrical meter outside the front of her house to catch fire. The fire never really developed and the flames never entered the property, although some smoke did. During that period, her son was in the house on his own, and she explained to me that all these months after the event, he was haunted by the fear that he did something wrong or that the fire would happen again. And she said, it'd be so helpful if you could have sent somebody to talk to him. When I offered to do this, she said it was now too late. So all these months after the fire, the sight, the smell, the sound of fires, the cues associated with it, instantly took him back to that traumatic event. We had resources in that area the next day or two, delivering leaflets to all the other properties in the area, but we never knocked back on their door. Had we done so, we could have sat down. The mother would have told us what her son needed. At no cost, we could have explained to him the fire was very unusual and he did everything right. We could further have actually told him, given him a badge and offered for him to be our ambassador and going to school, help to reach a group that are difficult for us to connect with and share that fire safety message. He may even inspired him to join a career for us. Instead, for an incident that if I asked the crew or looked at our records, we would describe as of minor value, of no real interest, people are living with the consequences for months, years, or potentially for life. During the course of my research of human behaviour, I heard many stories like that. And since then, I've been seeing fires and other emergencies in a completely different light. Why is it important and why now? I believe we stand at a critical moment with a choice to make. More than ever, I'm sure we all recognise that the world is rapidly changing, and so will the type of risks and incidents we face. Technology will create opportunities for fire service in the sector, but it will increasingly represent competition. Autonomous vehicles, robotics, and improved home technology have the potential to significantly reduce demand and change the nature of the roles required by emergency services. I believe we now need to create a new vision to guide future initiatives. If we cannot, others, including the public, may end up doing it themselves. In addition, I want to add a third, and in my view, even more compelling reason to transform. Because we need to understand fires and other emergencies as a human experience, in a way that the current system struggles to do. It may seem slightly counterintuitive, but digital and technology investments offer ways to make services more human, but they can have quite the opposite effect if misapplied. On that basis, I advocate that we should start with human-centered design as our first principle. In the following slides, we will look at some of the research findings and how I believe customer experience can help us to look at solutions. A very common technique used in customer experience is journey maps. These allow us to see the end-to-end contact from the public or the customer's perspective. They allow us to recognize that different people have different experiences. So if you were to buy something in store, that would be a different experience and engagement with the company than it would if you was to buy it online. But for companies, they want to make sure that that experience is always of the standard and in line with their values, regardless of how you arrive at the end point. One of the other things that's very helpful to see is the customer is the only person that sees this end to end. Whilst we have lots of processing systems to sit behind all these phases, the only person that travels from one end to the other is the customer. Coming back to the theme that Des quite rightly mentioned about learning, in the customer experience world, again, we have something called the voice of customer, which is at all points you want to sample and understand how the customer behaves, how they perceive things, what their needs are. It's recognized very much that it's the emotional engagement, the emotional experience people have that is very critical to their perception. They take very little notice of the things that sometimes take up our time in looking at process and procedure. They will just experience it from their perspective. And humans are complex and variable creatures, and we will all see that in slightly different ways. But at every one of these opportunities, there is an opportunity to learn. And actually, if things are going wrong, to fix it. If we've got the measurements in place and the ability to learn, we don't have to wait till after the event to fix things. We can make it right in the moment. Looking at this chart, the top one will seem perhaps familiar. It's where the fire service is involved, and prior to, there's a pre-event phase. There's a phase at which the public will respond, and certainly through the human behaviour research, we found that the public are very active, in many cases not following our advice to get out. They undertake a range of self-appointed tasks that are of value to them. Then we have the fire service response time, and something I've labelled rescue minutes, which is effectively what do we do when we arrive, and post-fire. Post-fire was very, very important, and we found that we left people vulnerable to harm from a fire afterwards because they had no support and they were ill-prepared for it. There's a lot I could talk about in these slides, but I just want to focus on a couple of key bits. Because our understanding of looking from the inside of the organisation out affects the experience that people have. By and large, in literature and in our day-to-day dealings, we take very little consideration of the public response. We don't record it, we don't take much notice of it because we assume it's largely irrelevant. For those involved, for the public, it's not. It's a very traumatic time. We focus a lot on the response time, which is quite interesting because it's certainly in the UK over the last 25 years, that has increased by nearly 50%. It's a hard variable to control. And actually all it tells you is we've arrived. It doesn't tell you we're making a difference. The rescue minutes is the bit we can train for, the period of which we can rescue people, we can put the fire out. And yet that is very difficult to find any information about where is doing it well, where needs to improve. So if we arrive and meet our response time, but we take 10 minutes before we do anything useful, the public experience that as a whole, but we focus our efforts in just to one place. So the journey map really helps us to really understand the full extent of what's happening. It also lets you know things that are important to the public. So one of the things we found in our research very early on was the influence of pets. We'd never depicted up through our analysis, but it was very clear that in their answers, pets were very, very important to people and a key driver of their behaviour. The other bit we've learned on, by having a partial interest in the bits that we do to the public, it meant the second line is highly relevant. This in the UK accounts for 70 to 80% of all domestic dwelling fires where the public never call the fire service. These are resolved successfully and effectively by members of the public. We know almost nothing about those, and we provide no services to support them, despite being the only fire service that they have access to. So the journey maps are a helpful way for us to visualize the experience of fire from the member of the public. It provides a very different lens. It's not about the technical procedures. It's very much about the emotional event and actually how it impacted that individual at that time. Another aspect of the customer experience helps us to understand the impact of silos, and these are very present in most organizations. It's where departments act in their own accord, in their own way. Different professions have different ways of looking at the world. And what we found is if you look at the experience that the survivor or the customer has, it includes all these phases. Along the way, they will meet different organizations and different sectors, but they're not connected. In the fire and rescue service, we will do the bit that we understand in terms of putting out the fire. Above that, we've got government and its agencies, accredited bodies, other fire and rescue services, consultants, equipment suppliers, academia. Nobody owns that journey that the public take when they experience an event, and therefore everyone does their bit. But it's not connected. We're not running academic studies that cut right the way through and give an overview of where is the best place to make a difference, where are the real needs and issues. And so we have at best a partial and fragmented view. It's a very complex environment for services, whether it's the fire service, the ambulance, managing the bit that sits above their silo can be very time consuming. This is ultimately a system, and what you do in one part makes a difference elsewhere. So as an example, if we think about responding to a fire, in recent studies, it's become very clear that we should be concerned about carcinogens and the exposure to those for operational personnel, which is absolutely right that we then look at how we mitigate that. But if we look at it as a system, at a time when we're saying every second counts and fire kills, some of the measures may be detrimental. So what you do in one part of the system affects other parts. If we were to remove the breathing apparatus sets off the back of the appliance and put them in a cab, that will incur a time penalty where we cannot put the set on en route. We now have to do it when we arrive. That may take an extra minute. But in doing that, that does delay our ability to get to the public. It's not an argument against trying to address the problem. It's that we need to be aware of the potential impact of any activity in one place on how it affects other areas. So visualizing it in this way helps us to see it as a system. It helps us to understand what we could do better to align, not only at operational level, but who needs to be speaking to each other beyond that. What we tend to find is that each service may talk to its neighbouring or adjacent sector, but doesn't actually go right the way through. I'm just going to give a very quick example of where we applied some of these principles to the burn survivor journey. It was the first time that I actually spoke to somebody who's in the burn specialist team, and I spent 6 years working with them as a result. This is an infographic we produced following a report we published 2 years ago, and obviously it's too much to read on the slide, it's just for illustration purposes. But what I wanted to just really pick out is, in doing this, we pick out silos, and it has practical implications. We are all committed not only to doing good, but to make sure we do no harm. And actually what we found is when we looked at certain issues, because we acted in isolation, we left people with injuries that they should not have had and outcomes that were avoidable if we looked at this as a system and managed it in that way and designed it to operate around the user needs and not just as a sum of the parts. So one of the most important things really was that we look at saving a life, and that's a necessary and valuable outcome. But actually, by the time you're getting to the burn specialist, they want to get people back to prevent condition, a very different aspiration, and one that actually, if we took that on board, could start at the scene. It would influence how we operate. So actually common purpose throughout, making sure that we're not leaving people vulnerable to harm. All of those things really came out, and this report's freely available if anyone would like to look at it in more detail. So just in coming to an end, I hope I've been able to provide some insight into what I believe are the implications of some of the human behaviour research. It is very much a brief and quick tour, but how we can also apply practice from the customer experience sector to provide human-centred services. Fire safety is a complex and multi-dimensional sector and has much to be proud of. However, the current model is starting to exhibit some significant flaws. The question is, would fixing those lead to improved fire safety solutions and outcomes? And would fixing those ensure we'd be ready to meet both the risks and opportunities of a rapidly changing world? At this point, doing nothing or taking too long to decide are very risky strategies. But before we can answer that question, we need to be clear about purpose. Is it to improve the current model or to create a new vision? To repair the existing structures or to build for the future? Through the work of numerous individuals and institutions, many of whom are represented here, and the work of those that preceded us, we have strong foundations. We have good people, a wealth of knowledge, and much that we can take forward. But I believe we must use those assets in different ways and develop new and adaptable models. And from strong foundations, we can afford to be bold and imaginative in what we build. We should set our aspirations high and be relentless in our quest, not just to be the best at what we do, but to ensure we're just as sighted on the impact we have, not just on our terms, but for those that must live with the consequences. I owe that to the mother and son that I mentioned earlier, and the countless others I met who helped me understand that it's the experience of consequences that matter just as much, if not more, than the fire itself. But to do that requires new perspectives and approaches. We must be broader in our outlook and more inclusive in our practice. Placing the public at the very heart of everything we do is the best way. That does not mean other activity is not valid, but everything must align and contribute to a clear outcome, making sure legislation, regulations, ways of working are all directed at ensuring the best experience and human outcomes. When something is so familiar, it's sometimes hard to imagine how else it could be, but through working through in the customer experience sector, I often find myself asking, how would, whichever your favorite brand is, solve this problem? How would they make us safer from fire and other emergencies? What is it about the organizations that you prefer that they do so well? I imagine it's that they understand you as a human. Equally, those that don't, you tend to avoid. To act and transform at this scale is daunting. It can take time even within one organization, let alone across the sector. But there is also an exciting opportunity to be had at the forefront and develop a new vision, fit for the future, human-centered, evidence-based and technology-enabled, and created by intentional design. We have that opportunity and must grasp it, because if we don't, others will. Thank you very much.